What would you do if your only son threw you out into the rain after selling your $2 family home behind your back? Don't miss today's journey. It will make you regret it. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the videos and subscribe, but only if you actually like what I do here. The night I lost my home was colder than any January I could remember. Frost clung to the railings like tiny shards of glass, and the wind cut through my coat as though it wasn't there. But it wasn't the weather that made my hands shake. It was the voice of my only son, James, sharp and unyielding, standing in the warm glow of the hallway and telling me I had to leave. The words seemed to fall in slow motion, each syllable a blow I could feel in my chest. Mom, you're making this impossible. You need to go tonight. Behind him, Eleanor stood, arms folded, her lips pressed into a thin line of triumph. I remember staring past them at the family photograph that still hung by the stairs, James as a boy, gap-toothed and grinning, holding my hand as if nothing in the world could part us. I had kept that frame dusted, polished, and perfectly straight through the years, a little shrine to a time when my son was mine alone. Now, in the space of a single evening, it was as though that boy had never existed. I wanted to ask him why, to plead with him, to remember the years I had worked myself to exhaustion, to keep a roof over his head, but his eyes blue, cold, and fixed somewhere beyond me, told me there was no point. The house smelled faintly of the beef stew I had simmered earlier, the same recipe my mother had passed down. But now the scent turned bitter in my nose. Eleanor's perfume, all sharp citrus and powder, overpowered it in the narrow hallway. I realized with a strange clarity that this was no sudden decision. It had been prepared, rehearsed. There was a small suitcase already by the door. My suitcase. He had packed it while I was in the kitchen washing dishes. My back turned to the two of them, who were already planning my absence. I'll find somewhere, I said, in disagreement. My voice trembled in a way that betrayed me. Somewhere, at my age, with no savings, I could call my own. Somewhere meant a borrowed sofa, a damp flat, or worse. I stepped past him and opened the door. The night air rushed in like a thief, stealing the last of the home's warmth from my bones. The narrow street outside was slick with frost, the street lamps casting their dull orange glow on the pavements where I had once walked James to school. I could almost hear the echoes of our footsteps, the sound of his small hand clapping mine on cold mornings. Now there was only the sound of my own breath, ragged and shallow. A neighbor's curtain twitched, the shadow of a face pulling back quickly, unwilling to be caught witnessing my humiliation. I stood there for a moment longer, my fingers tightening on the suitcase handle, feeling the hard plastic bite into my palm. Somewhere inside me, a small flame of anger flickered to life. This was my home, bought with my labor, my sacrifices, my late husband's sweat. And yet, with a few sentences spoken in that calm, detached tone, my son had turned me into a guest in my own life. No, worse, an intruder to be removed. As I stepped into the street, a passing gust brought with it the faint aroma of someone's coal fire, mingled with the metallic scent of winter rain on brick. I thought of my parents' home, long gone, and the way they had spoken about family as something sacred, something unbreakable. I wondered if they would even recognize this world, where a mother could be discarded, like last week's rubbish, because she would not bend to a daughter-in-law's will. Halfway down the street, I glanced back. The front door was closed, the light in the hallway already off. My home had shut its eyes to me. Somewhere deep inside, I knew this night was only the beginning, that whatever had been taken from me tonight was not just a roof over my head, but the very ground I had stood on all my life. And something else, something I could not yet name, was waiting just beyond the darkness to take even more. The terraced house in the narrow alley of Birmingham was no palace, but it was mine. And more than that, it was the vessel of my life's history. Its red brick walls bore the soot and rain of decades, the mortar weathered yet unyielding, much like myself in my younger years. On damp mornings, the place smelled faintly of boiled tea and wet stone, a scent that always reminded me of my mother's kitchen when I was a girl. I had moved in with James when he was barely a year old, carrying not just his weight on my hip, but the burden of a widow's uncertainty. The house was narrow, 2 up and 2 down, but it kept us warm in winter, shaded in summer, and held the kind of silence that could cradle grief without swallowing it. The alley was lined with similar houses, each one its own little kingdom. Children's voices often echoed against the brickwork, and every front step seemed to have its own story. Mrs. Ahmed from across the way would send over bowls of steaming lentil soup in winter, fragrant with cumin and garlic, insisting it was good for the bones. Old Mr. Hughes, 3 doors down, would bang his walking stick on the pavement when the postman was late, then invite me in for a chat over biscuits. We lived close, in every sense lives overlapping. Sorrows and joys passed along like second-hand jumpers. It was in this place that James grew from a boy who skinned his knees on the cobblestones to a man who thought the world too small for him. In those early days, the house was full of ritual. On the first full moon of every month, I would light incense at the small wooden altar in the living room, placing mandarins and cups of tea before the photographs of my parents. James would sometimes watch with a puzzled expression, asking why we fed people who were gone. I told him it wasn't feeding, it was remembering, honoring, keeping the thread between past and present unbroken. At New Year, I would polish every surface until it shone, then cook dishes that carried blessings for the months ahead, sticky rice for unity, fish for prosperity. The neighbors, even those who didn't share our traditions, understood their importance. Money was always tight, yet I never let James feel it. I stitched his school trousers when the knees wore thin, wrapped sandwiches in greaseproof paper, and walked instead of taking the bus so we could save the fare. When the factory where I worked introduced night shifts, I took them without hesitation. The work was cold and hard, on the hand steel that bit into your palms, machines that roared in your ears, but it kept the mortgage paid, and James in clean shoes. Every coin went into that house, every repair made with my own hands, or the help of kind neighbors. I remember one particularly harsh winter when the pipes froze, and I sat up all night with a hairdryer, coaxing the water back while James slept under an extra blanket. The walls rattled with the wind, the roof creaked, and yet I never felt afraid. The house was solid. It was ours. That knowledge was armor against the world. I had thought it would be my son's inheritance, not just the bricks and mortar, but the sense of belonging, of family, rooted in a place. Even as the city changed, the high-rises climbing higher, the old shops replaced by faceless chains, the alley remained much the same. The younger families brought in new rhythms, but the core of it, the slow heartbeat of neighborly life, held steady. I imagined James someday bringing his own family here, letting his children run up and down the same narrow path he once raced along. I dreamed of being the grandmother who cooked Sunday dinners in the same cramped kitchen, whose hands taught small fingers to wrap dumplings. Just so, but dreams have a way of curdling when the people in them no longer share the same heart. The first sign came when James, freshly graduated and with a new job in the city center, began speaking of the house as quaint in that patronizing tone that young people sometimes use. He talked of modern apartments with lifts and balconies, of moving somewhere with better access and less clutter. I laughed it off at first, telling him that some kinds of clutter family photographs, old crockery, worn armchairs were what made a place a home. He smiled politely but didn't answer. The day Eleanor first set foot in the alley, she wrinkled her nose slightly. Dachiasis, dachiso, soigigri, sakichi. She tried to hide it behind a pleasant smile. I caught it, though that faint gesture told me she didn't see the charm of our little street. On oisek, onterdaike, only its lack of gloss. Still, I told myself not to judge too soon. Love can soften the hardest edges, and perhaps she would grow to see what I saw. But as I watched her pick her way between puddles, high heels clicking awkwardly against the cobblestones, I felt a small, cold shadow pass through me, a warning I would only recognize much later. Back then, I could not have imagined that the very house whose walls had sheltered us through storms, whose floors had borne the weight of every step we'd taken together, would be taken from me by the same son I had built it for. Yet even in those early moments, the seeds were there, buried under smiles and polite words, waiting for the right season to break through the soil. The first time I met Eleanor was in my own kitchen, a place I had always considered my sanctuary. James had asked me to prepare something nice for dinner, which was his way of hinting he wanted a home-cooked meal that would impress. I decided on lamb stew with pearl barley, slow-simmered for hours, with carrots and onions melting into the broth, because it was both humble and rich. I dist en cre, en trabai, eter, I derp or. That told its own story about care and patience. I genchuwaus. When they arrived, I noticed how James's posture straightened as he introduced her, his hand resting lightly at the small of her back, as though presenting something rare and precious. Eleanor was beautiful in the way magazine covers are beautiful, sharp, deliberate, and styled to perfection. Her hair, a glossy dark brown, framed a face with careful makeup that gave the impression of effortlessness. She smiled warmly enough, her lips curving just so, but her eyes scanned the kitchen the way an estate agent surveys a property, cataloging the cracks in the tiles, the outdated kettle, the faint yellowing of the lace curtains from years of steam. It's very cozy, she said after a pause, as though trying to dress up a less generous thought. I told her that it had been my home for over 30 years, each mark and scratch a memory. She nodded politely, but her gaze drifted to the lamb stew, simmering on the stove. Over dinner, she asked questions in a tone that was half curious, half judging. Did I still work at the factory? Wasn't it exhausting at my age? Had I ever considered selling the house and moving somewhere more modern? I answered as graciously as I could, though I caught the faint arch of her eyebrow when I explained the importance of the altar in the living room. We light incense every full moon to honor our ancestors, I told her, describing how we lay out mandarins, tea, bakasai, tea gatig, and sometimes small cakes. Believing the departed could taste the essence of the food, she tilted her head, smiling as one might at a quaint but outdated tradition, and replied, "That's interesting." When James walked her to the bus stop later, I lingered at the window, watching them. Her hand was hooked around his arm, and say, She was speaking low, the way people do when they don't want to be overheard. I couldn't hear the words, only the way James nodded, his face softening in a manner I had not seen in years, not since he was a boy, showing me something he'd made at school. I told myself it was a good thing he'd found someone who made him happy, someone who could share his life, but there was an unease that I could not shake, as though she had walked into my home, not just as a guest, but as a quiet surveyor of territory she meant to claim. Their visits became more frequent after that. Eleanor always brought something: wine, expensive chocolates, a bouquet that never quite matched the season, and though her manners were impeccable, I could sense a subtle reshaping of the atmosphere whenever she was present. She moved things slightly on the counter, as if testing where they looked better. Asked James to fetch her a glass from the cupboard, as though she already knew where it was. Once, when I stepped out to hang laundry, I returned to find her standing in front of the ancestor altar, studying it closely. She didn't touch anything, but there was a faint frown on her face, the kind people wear when calculating how to replace an old fixture without upsetting the room's balance. It was during one such visit that she casually mentioned she and James had been looking at flats in the city center. We've seen some with floor-to-ceiling windows and concierge service, she said, her voice smooth, as though describing the weather. James added, we could have you come live with us. Mom, you'd have your own room, and the building has a lift, no more stairs. I laughed lightly, saying that I wasn't ready to leave the house, that it still had too much of my life in it to pack away. Eleanor smiled, but her fingers traced the rim of her wine glass in slow, deliberate circles. I tried not to read too much into these moments, telling myself that love requires a bit of adjustment on all sides. But each time Eleanor left, I felt as though a draft had slipped through the house, one that lingered long after the door closed. And though I could not name it yet, I was beginning to understand that she was not simply a visitor in James's life. She was a presence that would begin, in quiet increments, to change everything we knew. The engagement party was unlike anything our family had ever hosted or been invited to. In our tradition, such an occasion was usually held at the bride's home, with close relatives gathered in a warm room, offerings laid out for the ancestors, and food served in large bowls for sharing. But Eleanor's family had booked a private function room at a boutique hotel in the heart of the city, with polished marble floors, white tablecloths crisp enough to cut your finger on, and champagne flutes that caught the light like crystal ice. Even the air smelled expensive, a blend of lilies, polished wood, and the faint trace of imported perfume that seemed to drift from Eleanor's friends. James looked different that night, his hair trimmed sharper than usual, the set of his shoulders straighter. He wore a tailored suit I had never seen before, a gift from Eleanor, he later said. When he greeted me at the entrance, his smile was wide, but his eyes moved quickly over me, checking my dress, my shoes, the simple string of pearls I had worn for every important family event. I had chosen a deep blue dress, modest, well-pressed, bought years ago, but still holding its shape. It was the best I owned. But among the sequined gowns and sleek designer cuts in the room, I felt suddenly provincial, like an old postcard tucked between glossy travel brochures. Eleanor floated towards me in a gown of champagne silk that clung in all the right places, a diamond necklace glinting at her collarbone. "You look lovely," she said, her tone warm but slightly detached, as though complimenting a child's school drawing. She took my hand, cool and soft, and guided me to a table near the back. I noticed her parents and their circle seated closer to the head table. their laughter rising above the soft strains of the string quartet in the corner. The food came in courses I could barely name tiny, artful arrangements that looked like they belonged in a gallery more than on a plate. I longed for the generous platters of roast chicken, sticky rice, and steamed greens that marked our own celebrations, where people ate until they could eat no more, and no one worried about which fork to use. Here, each dish was presented with a description from a server. Some of the ingredients, so foreign they sounded made up. I ate quietly, listening as Eleanor's friends discussed investment portfolios, ski holidays in France, and the newest restaurants in Mayfair. James joined in easily, his voice adopting a new rhythm, his laugh fitting theirs as though he had rehearsed it. At one point, Eleanor's mother stood to make a speech. She spoke of the union of two families, though her words circled more around Eleanor's achievements, her law degree, her position at a prestigious firm, than around James himself. When she did mention him, it was with a tone of indulgence, like someone praising a promising apprentice. I clapped politely, my hands feeling heavy. No one spoke of our side of the family, of my late husband's years at the factory, or the way we had scraped and saved to put James through school. There was no mention of the narrow alley where his first steps had echoed, the house that had been his anchor through every storm. After the speeches, Eleanor and James made their way to each table, thanking guests. When they reached mine, Eleanor leaned in and whispered, "I know it's not quite the way you might have done it, but it's our future. We're celebrating tonight." Her words were coated in sweetness, but I caught the undertone, a line drawn between my ways and hers, with James already planted firmly on her side. Later, as I waited for the taxi, I watched them through the glass doors of the hotel. Eleanor's hand rested lightly on James's chest as she spoke to a group of her friends, her laugh bright and effortless. James bent his head to hear her, smiling as though nothing outside that circle existed. For the first time, I wondered if my son's life was shifting into a shape where I no longer fit, where the history we shared was a quaint relic he would one day pack away without regret. The taxi pulled up, and as the city lights slid past the window, I held on to my small clutch bag with both hands, the way one might hold on to a lifeline. I knew then that this marriage was going to be more than a merging of two families. It would be a quiet contest for the space James and I had once occupied together, and I feared, with a cold certainty, that I was already losing ground. It was a late September evening when the first true battle between Eleanor and me took place, and it happened over something I had never imagined could spark such heat, the ancestor altar. I had been living in the terraced house alone since James moved into a rented flat with Eleanor after the wedding. Yet when they visited, I made sure the place still felt like home for him. The kettle ready to boil, his favorite shortbread in the tin, the living room warm with the faint scent of sandalwood incense. That night, I had lit the altar as I always did before the full moon, laying out mandarins and a cup of green tea for my parents and my late husband. The flame flickered gently, casting soft shadows on the old photographs. Eleanor arrived first, sweeping into the living room with the confident glide of someone who believes every space will adapt to her presence. She stopped short when her gaze fell on the altar. Her nose wrinkled ever so slightly, a fleeting movement most might miss. But I had seen such expressions before, usually on visitors who could not reconcile faith with tradition. The living with the dead, she stepped closer, the heels of her boots tapping on the worn floorboards. "Still doing this?" she asked lightly, as if it were a quaint hobby. "Don't you think it's a bit outdated? I mean, we could make better use of this corner." maybe a bookshelf or a drinks cabinet when we move you to the new place. Her words landed like cold water on my chest. I told her, evenly, that the altar was not decoration, it was family. Every offering keeps their memory alive, I said, my hand resting on the edge of the table where the brass incense holder sat. It's what connects us to who we are. Eleanor's smile tightened, and she began to rearrange a nearby vase. Her movements, too deliberate to be casual. I understand traditions, she said, but James and I are building a modern home. Some things belong to the past. James arrived moments later, kissed Eleanor on the cheek, Adenan, Anfreacher, Enke Christe, Enkes for seeing, Anfreige Kroweinser, then noticed the shift in the air. What's going on? He asked, glancing between us. Eleanor gave a small laugh and said, nothing, just talking about how to make things more contemporary. I told him plainly that the altar was staying, no matter where I lived. His face flickered with something I couldn't name hesitation, perhaps, or embarrassment. We'll see, he said at last, his tone neutral, the gansen saying, Gergfaki, thought Gergo. His eyes avoided mine. Dinner was tense. Eleanor picked at her food, occasionally glancing towards the living room as though the altar might grow larger and consume the space. When they left, she leaned close to James at the door, whispering something I couldn't hear. He nodded. Anin kees gitsi, and in kin dafrik fris, sponsor yan, thorward key, den stout inkrite. The sound of their footsteps faded into the night. I stood alone in the living room, the soft scent of sandalwood still hanging in the air. I lit another stick of incense, more for myself than for the ancestors, and watched the smoke curl upward like a question without an answer. In our tradition, the eldest son was the guardian of family customs, the one who would carry forward the memory of those who came before. Yet here was my own son, gently pushed by the woman he loved, turning away from that duty as if it were no more than an old coat to be donated. I had no way of knowing then that this small disagreement was the first stone in a landslide. That night, I told myself it was only a difference of opinion, a harmless clash of worlds. But in the stillness, as the incense burned down to ash, I felt the first true fracture in the bond between us, a quiet, hairline crack that would one day split open wide enough to swallow everything we had built together. It was a gray November afternoon when James first brought up the matter of transferring the house into his name. We were in the kitchen, the light outside already fading into that early winter dusk that seems to creep in before you've had time to prepare. I had just taken a tray of scones from the oven, their buttery scent filling the room, when he cleared his throat in that way he used to as a boy, before asking for something he knew I might refuse. Mom, he began, pulling out a chair and sitting opposite me. Eleanor and I have been talking with a financial advisor. He says it would make sense tax-wise if the house were in my name. He said it like he was offering me a clever trick. I key way to outwit the system, his tone casual but rehearsed. It's just on paper. You'd still live here as long as you like. The words didn't sit right, even as he smiled reassuringly. My house, my mortgage, paid off after years of double shifts at the factory. Mani no kibas an kinker kimor, gaini niger kecho on the gain, and an kinker green. James's clothes instead of buying new, skipping holidays, so the payments never fell behind. I asked him why it couldn't stay in my name if it made no practical difference. He gave a vague answer about future planning and avoiding probate complications, but there was a flicker in his eyes, quick evasive, that reminded me of when he used to hide the fact he'd broken something in the house. A week later, he brought me to a solicitor's office in the city center. The building was glass and steel, the lobby scented faintly of lemon polish. The solicitor, a young man in a navy suit that looked more expensive than my monthly pension, slid the papers across the desk with a smoothness that suggested he'd done this 100 times before. It's a standard transfer, he explained. Your son becomes the legal owner. And you retain full right to reside until you choose otherwise. His voice was professional, but there was something in his eyes, just a flicker, that told me he knew the ground beneath my feet was shifting. I hesitated. The pen felt heavy in my hand. I thought of the altar in the living room, the way the photographs of my parents looked back at me each time I passed, as if asking whether I was protecting what they had passed down. But James's hand was on my shoulder, warm and steady. It's just paperwork. Mom, trust me, the signature came easier than I cared to admit. A few strokes of ink, and the deed that had been in my name for decades was now his. The solicitor slid the documents away, already turning to the next task. While James thanked him warmly, we walked out into the drizzle, the city lights blurred by the rain. James talked about lunch. Applebury e Andres Gelseyer Pro. Micah Sige cooking. Going to the new Italian place Eleanor liked, as if nothing significant had happened. That night, I lay in bed, listening to the hum of the radiator. The house felt different, not in any way I could touch, but in a way that settled deep in my bones. The walls still held the same photographs, the same faint scent of sandalwood, but the ownership, the anchor had shifted. I told myself that I had done it for James, for the sake of keeping the family's future secure. But a small, unwelcome thought lodged itself in my mind. I had given away the one thing that proved, in cause, unpriced in us in the eyes of the world, that this was my home. In our traditions, the eldest son inherits not just the property, but the responsibility to care for the family within it. It was a sacred trust, bound up with respect and duty. I wanted to believe James understood that. Yet in the silence of that November night, with rain tapping against the windows, I felt the first stirrings of unease, an instinct that told me that trust, once given, could be as fragile as paper in water. The first winter in the tower block felt like waking in a world that looked familiar but sounded wrong, as if all the small noises of a home had been replaced with echoes from a place that wasn't mine. After the transfer of the house, James and Eleanor insisted I move in with them for convenience, saying it would save me the trouble of maintaining the terraced place. I knew better than to believe it was for my benefit, but the way James spoke, gentle but firm, left me little space to refuse. Within weeks, I was standing in the gleaming white lobby of their new apartment building, suitcase in hand, staring at polished floors that reflected the overhead lights like water. The flat was on the 16th floor, a long ride up in a lift that smelled faintly of disinfectant and something floral, probably Eleanor's doing. Inside, everything was pristine, the kind of order that doesn't come from daily living, but from careful design. The living room was awash in cool grays and glass. The eeg sauk ansaz gigier I am gi dei ki gias dear goitiyarku, a panorama of city rooftops and traffic far below. No incense, no warm clutter of books and blankets, no faint hum of the old fridge. Even the air felt thinner here, recycled and chilled by the building's ventilation system. Eleanor welcomed me with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She showed me to a spare bedroom at the far end of the hall, its white walls bare, except for a single abstract print. The bed was made with precision, the kind you'd find in a hotel. "You'll be comfortable here," she said, her tone polite but distant, as if she were speaking to a long-term guest rather than family. In those early weeks, her corrections came wrapped in silk. "Oh, we don't keep shoes in the hallway. It ruins the look. Could you use coasters? The table's real oak. We prefer the dishwasher for hygiene." Small things, harmless on their own, yet they chipped at my sense of belonging. My way of folding laundry was old-fashioned. The herbal teas I brewed in the evenings left too strong a smell. And when I suggested setting up a small altar in my room, she smiled lightly and said, "Best to keep personal items minimal. It's a shared space." After all, James rarely intervened. He worked long hours, often coming home tired, loosening his tie at the door, while Eleanor handed him a drink. At dinner, conversation was often about his work or their friends' latest holidays. My stories from the alley, the neighbors I missed, were met with polite nods before the topic shifted. It was as though the life I'd lived before entering this flat had been filed away in a drawer no one meant to open again. From my bedroom window, I could see the city stretch into the distance, its lights blinking like indifferent stars. I would watch the buses winding along the streets far below, imagining them heading down roads. I knew roads that smelled of damp brick and takeaway chips, roads that ended in places where people still nodded to each other in passing. Here, the only sounds at night were the low hum of the lift cables and the muffled thud of footsteps in the corridor. It wasn't just the space that was different. It was the rules, unspoken, yet enforced. If I used the kitchen, I cleaned every surface immediately. If I watched television, I left no trace of my presence, not even a cushion out of place. Slowly, I began to retreat into my room. Tasisi, Sihiwarkwichi, space where I could brew tea without commentary, where the faint smell of sandalwood from a hidden incense stick reminded me of the home I'd left. Still, I told myself to be patient. It was winter, after all, a season when tempers shorten and rooms feel smaller. Perhaps by spring, the air in this place would warm to fit me, but deep down, I already knew that a home without the texture of shared history is only a place to sleep, and I feared that one day, even that small refuge in the spare room would no longer be mine to keep. The Lunar New Year had always been the brightest thread in the fabric of my life, a day when the house filled with the scent of simmering pork belly, the pop of firecrackers from the street, and the hum of voices weaving blessings into the air. Even in the narrow alley, we would hang red paper banners by the door, scrub the house until it gleamed, and lay out offerings for the ancestors, steaming bowls of rice, fish for abundance, mandarins for good fortune. It was the one day each year when the living and the dead shared the same table. That first New Year in the tower block was nothing like that. I woke early, as always, determined to bring a little of the old rhythm into this strange, polished space. In my small bedroom, I had already tucked away a few mandarins, a packet of incense, ans akanj, and sat hbi, soisigsfo, anki tertiaries, offerfries my peel, my perikis de saichi, angasalk year weirbat sterig. I planned to prepare a modest altar on my desk, just enough to greet the year properly. But when I stepped into the kitchen, Eleanor was already there, dressed in her robe, sipping coffee from a white porcelain cup. The smell of the beans was sharp, bitter, and entirely out of place for the day. She glanced at the oranges in my hands. "What's all that for?" she asked, her tone even, but her eyes cool. I told her it was for the New Year offering, that I just need a little corner of the living room for the altar until the incense burned down. Her lips pressed together. Then she shook her head slowly. "Mom, this is a no-smoking building. Incense counts as smoke, and honestly, we don't need all that superstition here. We'll have a nice dinner instead." The word superstition landed in my chest like a stone. I tried to explain that it wasn't about belief in magic. It was about honoring those who came before us, keeping our place in the line of family that stretched back generations. She turned away, rinsing her cup in the sink. "I understand you grew up with it," she said, "but James and I want to build our own traditions." James emerged from the bedroom. Then, hair still tousled from sleep, I looked at him, silently asking for his help. He hesitated only a moment before siding with her. "Mom, it's just one day without the incense. We can celebrate in other ways." His voice was gentle, but the choice in it was already made. I swallowed my protest, but inside it felt like a thread had snapped. The day went on without the scent of sandalwood curling through the rooms, without the soft glow of candlelight on old photographs. Eleanor ordered a takeaway feast from an upscale Chinese restaurant, everything arriving in neat, uniform boxes with labels in English. The food was fine, even good, but it was missing the weight of memory, the hands that had shaped dumplings with care, the steam rising from pots in a kitchen that smelled of garlic and ginger. As we ate at the sleek glass table, I noticed how quiet it was. No neighbors dropping by to exchange blessings. No children laughing as they counted their red envelopes. Just the faint hum of the refrigerator and the sound of Eleanor describing a colleague's ski trip. My gaze drifted to the window, where the city lights blinked against the dark. Somewhere out there, the alley would be alive with warmth and noise. Doors open to welcome the year in. When the plates were cleared, I returned to my room. I lit a single stick of incense by the window, the smallest one I had, and watched the smoke curl upward before fading into the night. I whispered my New Year's prayer quietly, so that only the ancestors could hear, but I couldn't shake the thought that something had shifted again, more than the calendar turning. This wasn't just the loss of a ritual. It was the erasure of a bridge between who we had been and who they wanted us to become. It happened on a rainy Tuesday, one of those days when the clouds hang so low, you feel you could touch them if you leaned out the window. Eleanor had gone to work, and James was away on a business trip, leaving the flat eerily silent, except for the distant hum of the lift cables. I had been tidying the living room more out of habit than necessity when I noticed a faint, familiar scent in the air. Not the sterile citrus of Eleanor's cleaning sprays, but something warmer, earthier. It took me a moment to place it. The scent of the cedarwood chest from the old terraced house, the one that had stood in my bedroom for decades. Following it, I found myself in their study, and Cholgi Krising, a room I rarely entered. The curtains were drawn halfway, letting in a soft gray light that fell across a sleek black desk and a tall filing cabinet in the corner. One drawer was slightly ajar. I told myself to leave it, that it wasn't my place, but the scent was stronger here, and curiosity tugged at me like a child pulling at my sleeve. I eased the drawer open just enough to see inside. Among neatly labeled folders and a stack of envelopes was a plain brown envelope with my handwriting on it. My heart gave a small, startled jolt. I reached in and pulled it out. The weight, instantly familiar. Thick paper, the faint texture of the legal documents I had handled when the house was transferred. I unfolded it on the desk. my fingers trembling as my eyes scanned the words. It wasn't just the deed to the house, it was a record of sale, dated 3 months before I had moved into the flat. The price printed in bold made my breath catch. Sadao, 2 million, my terraced home in the alley, with its worn steps and narrow garden, had been sold for more than I'd ever imagined. And the new owner listed was a property developer, not James. I felt the air thin around me. If the house had been sold before I left it, then the transfer into James's name had not been just paperwork. It had been the first step in removing me entirely. The thought that he had stood in the solicitor's office with me, speaking in that calm, reassuring tone, while already knowing this truth, it was like swallowing glass. A floorboard creaked in the hallway, and I quickly slid the papers back into the envelope, tucking it exactly where I had found it. My hands smelled faintly of cedarwood, as though the chest from my old bedroom had reached out to remind me of where I came from, of what had been taken. I closed the drawer and stood there for a moment, listening to the silence. The rain outside had grown heavier, tapping against the windows like impatient fingers. I went back to my room, sitting on the bed without removing my coat. My mind replayed every conversation with James since the transfer, searching for signs I should have seen. There were plenty: the vague answers, the rush to sign, the way he never spoke of the alley house again. Each memory now looked different. Colored by this discovery, I lit a stick of incense not for the ancestors this time, but for myself. As the smoke curled upward, I thought of the small envelope in that drawer, holding the truth I had not been meant to find. It felt like holding the corner of a curtain and knowing that behind it was something far darker than I could yet see. And I knew, with a clarity that left no room for denial, that whatever came next would strip away what little trust still remained between us. It began with a list, Eleanor's list. She had written it in her tidy, looping script and left it on the kitchen counter one Saturday morning, as if it were no more than a shopping note. At the top, in neat underlined letters, it read, "Household rules." Beneath, 10 numbered points spelled out exactly how things were to be done in the flat. No cooking after 8 p. and Jaguar. No hanging laundry indoors. No incense or strong-smelling foods. No visitors without prior approval. It was the kind of list one might leave for a tenant, not a mother-in-law. I stood there reading it, my hands tightening around the paper. When James came into the kitchen, still in his dressing gown, I held it out to him. "What is this?" I asked. "Ein Fragis." He glanced at it, then looked away, rubbing the back of his neck. "It's just to keep things running smoothly," he said. Eleanor thought it would be good to set boundaries. Boundaries. The word felt like a brick wall, dropped between us. I told him I'd lived in this country my whole life, kept my own home in order, without anyone telling me how, and didn't need a list to remind me how to be respectful. He sighed, that weary sigh I'd come to dread, and said, "Mom, it's her home too. You can't expect everything to be your way." By the time Eleanor came into the kitchen, I was still standing there, the list on the counter between us like a declaration of war. She poured herself coffee, glancing at me over the rim of her cup. "I hope you don't mind," she said, her tone polite but laced with steel. "It's just easier when everyone knows the expectations." I told her calmly that I would not stop cooking my own meals when I needed to, nor would I give up incense in my private room. Her smile faltered. "That's not really negotiable," she replied, setting the cup down with a soft click. The argument that followed seemed to shake the very walls. My voice rose, telling her she had no right to dictate my life. Not after I had raised James in a home she would have dismissed as unworthy. She accused me of being inflexible, of clinging to outdated habits that disrupted their life. James stepped between us, trying to calm the air. But when I refused to agree to her rules, his voice hardened. If you can't respect the way we do things here, maybe this isn't the right place for you. The sentence hung in the air, heavy and sharp. I stared at him, my own son, speaking as though I were a stranger who had overstayed her welcome. My hands were trembling, but not from fear. Something hotter burned in my chest. I told him I had respected this household from the moment I moved in. But respect was a two-way street, and mine had been met with contempt. By the time the shouting stopped, the apartment felt colder. Eleanor had left the room, slamming the door behind her, and James was standing with his arms crossed, his expression closed. The list still sat on the counter, untouched, except for the crease my fingers had left in the paper. I left it there, walked back to my room, and shut the door. As I sat on the edge of the bed, the city outside buzzing faintly through the windows, I realized that what had just happened wasn't a minor disagreement. It was the breaking point. There would be no going back to quiet civility after this. The unspoken truth was out in the open now. I was not part of their vision for the future, and they were already preparing for the day they would no longer have to pretend otherwise. The bank smelled of carpet glue and printer ink, a sterile perfume that made my stomach pitch. I queued between a man in a high-vis jacket, counting coins, with a thumb blackened by oil, and a woman in a camel coat, tapping her card against her palm as though summoning patience. Rain beaded on the glass doors and slid down in quicksilver lanes. My coat steamed faintly in the overheated air. When it was my turn, the teller, a young woman with a nose ring, as delicate as a raindrop, offered me a professional smile. "How can I help?" she asked. "And the chaos and gain chen gan the quiters gander bike uniswar gauss 4K for an ally I grantures danger cookery. Gore words felt like a bridge I wasn't sure would hold my weight. I placed my passbook and ID on the counter and told her I needed to review recent activity, transfers, anything relating to the sale of my former property. The sentence sounded too formal, borrowed from TV dramas, where people spoke in evidence, not grief. She nodded and clicked at her keyboard, the clatter like a tiny hailstorm. "I can see a large credit to an account with your surname," she said after a moment, eyes flicking to me and back to the screen. "But it's not this account. It's linked to the same address you had before Christmas." She printed something, the paper hot where it slid into my hand. Columns of numbers marched across the page, indifferent soldiers. There it was, Trusaki, 200s, Tsurusayoneng, Nardsangri, deposited in an account under J. Whitfield, with an annotation that tasted like metal on my tongue. Proceeds of sale, Claremont Terrace. Date, mid-December, the week I'd been persuaded to sign the transfer at the solicitor's office. The week Eleanor had hosted a drinks party where champagne snapped like brittle glass in my teeth. My mouth tried to shape words and failed. The teller's gaze softened. "Do you want to speak with someone in the back?" A manager, her voice was quiet. "It grasachai the feistenbray," a shawl around a shock. I nodded because the room had begun to tilt, and a fixed point would help. In the small office that smelled faintly of stale tea and laminate, a manager with careful hair and a tie that had lost its will to be straight offered me water. "I'm afraid, Mrs. Whitfield, we can only discuss the account that's in your name," he recited, then less recitation, "but we can confirm transactions If you are a named party on the documentation, I was the owner, I said. Past tense cracked like thin ice under a boot. He opened another screen, brows tightening. The deeds were transferred to your son before the sale. Standard form TR1 executed. Det bankitarke say. Anforchager genkin unforesee. DS1 discharge of charge. Then completion. He looked up, measuring me, the human calculation that finds you standing in a space you had thought was solid. I'm sorry, he added. And it was the kind of sorry that flowers offer when the frost has already come. I left with 2 pages and a new tremor in my hands. Outside, the rain had gentled into a mist that licked the air. The printout rasped when I folded it, the paper's grain catching like a breath in a throat. On the corner by the bus stop, Abekasteiser, Andrager, Psikitas. Bakery door opened and exhaled warm yeast, sugar, and cinnamon, and the scent pulled me sideways into a memory I had not touched in years. My husband, coat damp from the factory, arriving home on a payday Friday with a paper bag of iced buns, steam sticking the paper to the icing. We ate them over the sink, laughing at the mess. And he said, with the sticky bravado of a good man who believes tomorrow will keep its promise, one day this house will be worth more than any bonus. We'll give it to James, and he'll honor it. The memory folded itself small and slid back into my chest, sharper than before. I took the number 8, the bus purring like a cat that might bite. The paper thrummed in my bag with every pothole, stubborn proof that refused to be absorbed into the fog of disbelief. At the Citizens' Advice Office, a woman with gray plaited hair listened while I laid out the facts as if setting the table for a wake. The transfer, the sale, the eviction. She circled dates in green pen, underlined sums. Diane finally said, "You'll need a solicitor who's conflict-free. Given the family connection, avoid the firm that handled the transfer." And she tapped her pen on the sale date. "If you were promised a right to remain, we'll want to see it in writing. If it isn't, then we look at undue influence, misrepresentation, possibly constructive trust." The words were new tools in my mouth, heavy but promising leverage. She gave me 3 names on a leaflet that smelled of fresh ink and hope. I chose the smallest practice on the list, the one above a newsagent, where the window displayed lottery ads and a cardboard cutout of a smiling couple who'd won a fortune. The solicitor was a woman about my age with strong hands and a cardigan the color of rain. She read the printouts and the photocopy of the deed I'd kept, then leaned back, eyes narrowing, as if she were sighting a distant shape on water. "Your son had you sign a transfer that effectively made him the proprietor," she said, careful with each syllable. "And then he sold to a developer. If there was a promise of your right to occupy, but not recorded as a restriction or covenant, we're in the land of," she said, "unless we can show undue influence, lie staying in, lack of independent advice, or that the transfer was part of a common intention that you'd be looked after." She paused. Did anyone explain the consequences at the time? The room seemed to press inward. "A young man in a navy suit," I said. "He sounded like a metronome." She gave a small, wry smile. "They often do." She drafted letters while I watched. The clatter of keys, a little orchestra of purpose. Pre-action protocol. Request for disclosure. Notice to developer. She asked for names, dates, the silly details that stories hinge upon, what James wore the day of the signing, what Eleanor said when I lit incense, the color of the carpet in the solicitor's waiting room. "Details persuade," she murmured, "and they jog memory, wins cases when paper fails. She gave me homework, bank statements from the months before the transfer, any texts where promises were made, contact details for neighbors who could speak to the history of the house. The alley matters, she said, unexpected warmth in her voice. A place becomes a witness. By late afternoon, I was back in the little room above the shop. The radiator hiccuped like an old neighbor telling you a joke in installments. I spread the documents on the desk, the sale printout, the photo of my parents, the thin pen I'd stolen by accident from the bank. The smell of sandalwood lingered faintly from the stick I'd burned the night before, and it brought another fragment to the surface, an older one, edged and heavy. I am kneeling at the altar the week my husband died. The smoke, a soft rope rising. James is 16, too tall for his grief. And he says, Dad wanted me to study law. I pressed the joss stick into the sand and whispered to the photographs. Keep him straight in a world that bends boys. The kitchen smells of ginger and black tea. Outside, rain pummels the bins. I make a promise I have kept every day since, to hold the house until James can carry it. The memory was short, a breath, but it left the room cooler. My phone buzzed with a number I didn't know. Is that you? Love. It's Mrs. Ahmed. I feel que c'est free. A familiar voice poured in, thick with coriander and concern. Mr. Hughes told me he'd seen you in the rain. I've some news you should hear. My throat tightened. I'm listening. A pause. The sound of a spoon against a pot. When they cleared your house, she said, "Aitiang in sequent, Bakofiang and main Freiber Ibrobies and from the developer told the removal lads there'd been a main sent for yes will with a codicil." My skin prickled. My husband's will. She said, my cousin's boy was on the job. I said he heard mention of life interest and trustee. He didn't understand, but he remembered those words, said he thought of you, the way you lit candles for your mom and dad. And he told me to tell you. The room seemed to tilt again, but this time, not from loss, from alignment. A codicil, I repeated, tasting the old legal word. A tale sewn onto a creature you thought you knew. After we hung up, I sat there, the rain, tapping the window in an impatient rhythm, and looked at the list my solicitor had given me. Neighbors. I wrote Mrs. Ahmed, underlined it twice. Under text, Aitubai Gesibai. Sikristai. I wrote Eleanor house rules, then added James, just paperwork. For Gyog. Under documents. I wrote husband's will, locate original, and felt the ink deepen under the pen, as if weight could be made on paper, somewhere in the drawer of a forgotten sideboard, or the back of a filing cabinet in a dusty firm, there might be an old piece of paper with my husband's voice ossified into clauses, one that said the house was never truly mine to give away, nor James's to sell free of obligation. By evening, the city smelled of wet stone and frying onions from the shop below. I brewed tea and sipped it too hot, letting it scald sense into me. The printout with Tuller, $200, Nero, ear zero, glowed under the lamp. I smore cries say, Alfred Bracy is small, cold sun. I thought of Eleanor's manicured fingers tapping a calculator, of James's soft voice reassurances. And kakonse, banke, barking canyon, on barske kase. There's of the brown envelope in their drawer that had betrayed them to me. I thought, too, of the alley, how places remember, and of a codicil whispering from the past, like a thread tugging at my sleeve. If the house had been placed in trust for me, if a life interest had been carved into the walls long before lawyers with neat hair and metronome voices. Then my eviction was more than cruelty. It was a trespass against the dead. I put out the lamp, left the window a crack open, and let the night blow its damp breath across the incense tin. Tomorrow, I would knock on every door that had witnessed our beginnings, tap every archive that kept its secrets in dust. I would find the will, and when I did, I would not be asking my son for decency. I would be serving him notice. The alley gave up its secrets, the way old houses give up their heat slowly at first. Then all at once, I arrived beneath a sky the color of dishwater, wind nosing at my scarf, and found Mrs. Ahmed waiting by her gate with a thermos clutched to her chest like a relic. "Come in, love," she said, ushering me through a frame of dripping coriander. Her kitchen was a warm fog of cumin, onions, and steam, the windows filmed with scent. On the table sat a biscuit tin with a dented lid and a parcel wrapped in the brown paper builder's favor. "My cousin's boy dropped these," she murmured, tapping the tin. "Said they were headed for the skip when they cleared your loft. He thought better of it." My hands moved before my mind caught up. The lid rasped open to reveal a hoard of the past, stiff envelopes, a fountain pen, photographs stuck together at the corners by time. Beneath them, tied with frayed red thread, was a smaller bundle that seemed to hum with its own warmth. We loosened the thread and slid out a sheaf on thin, creamy paper. The title bloomed up at me, "A Last Will and Testament of Arthur Whitfield," and beneath it, in smaller script, "Codicil executed the 12th night of January 2006. I felt my breath snag. "Read it," Mrs. Ahmed urged softly, pouring tea that smelled like comfort. The words lined themselves into meaning with a terrible gentleness. "I give and devise my property at Claremont Terrace to my wife for her life, with full right to reside and quiet enjoyment, and Eiger cake. I declare that my son James shall take the remainder only upon her death, and upon the condition that he honor our ancestral rights within said home." My eyes stung. The letters blurred. Further down, "Alkinat and se, and frama se, archikai se, contrai tro, se and tro, and tron, ensis, framline and croic, se qui says, I say aintre se." I could almost hear my husband's voice inside. "No sale shall be made without the written consent of my wife and the trustee, herein named." The trustee, my mouth shaped his name before I said it, Mr. Patel, from the law center. Mrs. Ahmed nodded. "I remember him, kind eyes." I traced the signature, my husband's careful hand, and the witness names, Mira Patel and John Hughes. "John Mr. Hughes," I said, eyes leaping. "He witnessed," she grinned, quick and sly. "He did mention once, after a funeral, that he'd stood beside a pen and a promise." A gust worried the back door. The string of garlic swung like a pendulum, marking time that had suddenly looped back on itself. I turned the final page and found a letter on Mr. Patel's headed paper, the ink faint but legible. "Copy enclosed for safekeeping at the family's request. Original lodged with firm." At the bottom, a hand had scrawled a note in pencil. "If Patel retires, successor trustee is the firm." We took the tin to Mr. Hughes, who met us in his doorway, smelling of mothballs and rain. "I thought that box had vanished with all the other good things," he said, ushering us past a coat stand bowed with history. His sitting room was a museum of Birmingham weather, and the black country's grit coal scuttle by the hearth, Aikanyaikem, Engen, a rug worn honest. When he saw the signature, a slow smile exhaled along his face. I, he said, tapping the witness's line with a knuckle as knobbly as a root. He got me to pop by. Said he wanted the boy safe from himself if the world ever made him foolish. He looked up at me over his glasses, eyes as blue as winter. He loved you fierce. Your Arthur, that codicil's not a wish. It's a wall. Did anyone contact you when the house was sold? I asked. Mr. Hughes barked a soft laugh. No one contacts the old unless they want a casserole or a story. He pushed himself up with his stick. But I remember another thing. Agerge, anham, yuahai, dangebaz surzeg. Carl, from a posh firm, came after Mr. Patel passed. She said they'd be handling his files. Pretty brisk, like a nurse on a schedule. The air seemed to lean closer. Do you recall her name? He shook his head. Only her card white, thick as toast. Might still be in a drawer. We found it, slipped in among takeaway menus. Graham and Lowther, LLP. Property and private client, E. Carlyle, associate. The room tilted, then steadied around a name I had heard in 100 dinner table anecdotes. Eleanor Carlyle, I said aloud, and the syllables tasted of stainless steel. Mrs. Aichitiyai. Ahmed made a soft, outraged sound. You don't mean she handled Mr. Patel's successor files, I said, my voice thin with disbelief. And later, my house transfer. The water in the kettle began to simmer again and say, Yinbuyating, dangerous murmur. I took the card to my solicitor that afternoon, the sky a bruise that refused to fade. She read the codicil without speaking, then exhaled through her nose, as if she'd been holding her breath for years. This changes everything, she said. I case tu sacriste. A life interest is a lock. Your consent was required for any sale, and the trustee should have guarded that gate. If Ms. Carlyle's firm took over Mr. Patel's practice, they were trustee by succession. That means your daughter-in-law's firm owed you a duty. She tapped the paper with a blunt forefinger. And if she advised your son while also sitting on the trust, that's a conflict so bright it should be visible from space. The print of her cardigan left a faint scent of wool and lavender. We'll seek an injunction to freeze any remaining proceeds, she went on, the words turning into scaffolding, and will demand disclosure of the file that records how this sale was permitted. What if the file is missing? I asked. Gail, tasting dread, she gave me a smile like flint. Paper has a way of leaving footprints. Emails, calendar entries, billing logs, and people remember things they later wish they'd forgotten. She picked up her phone and began to dictate a letter. Her voice clipped and precise. The keys clicked like rain on a tin roof. Breach of trust, conflict of interest, account of profits. The phrases were iron rods slotting into place. I left her office into light that smelled of wet pavement and bus exhaust, the codicil tucked inside my coat like a heartbeat. At the corner, the church door stood ajar, the faint sweetness of furniture polish and candles leaking into the cold. I stepped inside on a pull I didn't question. The nave was empty, except for a ladder, and a man in paint-spattered overalls polishing brass. Sorry. Love, he said, not unkindly. We're getting ready for a christening. The air held the ghost of lilies and wax. I sat in the back pew and watched dust motes rise and fall in a shaft of pale light, the way memory does when you stop moving long enough for it to settle. I am in this same church the winter after Arthur died. James and I sit shoulder to shoulder, our coats still smelling of the bus. My hands keep finding each other in my lap. After the service, Mr. Patel meets us by the font. You mustn't worry, he says, voice soft as bread. I've arranged it so that what you built together can't be swept from under your feet. His breath smells faintly of cardamom. Men fear death most when their hands are empty. He left you something to hold. James watches the votive candles with the seriousness of a boy who thinks fire understands him. I'll look after Mum, he says, and for a moment the promise is a warm, solid brick in the wall of my chest. When I stepped back into the wind, my phone was buzzing. James's name lit the screen. I let it ring until his voice poured into the air, taut and unusually formal. Mum, I've had a call from someone at a firm, your solicitor, I assume. What are you doing? You're making this messy. The word landed like a smear. I pressed the phone closer, feeling the cold bite my ear. I found Dad's codicil, I said. Silence widened between us like a fog bank, then split. You shouldn't have gone digging, he snapped. What's done is done. We've allocated the funds. There are plans. Eleanor, he stopped, swallowed audibly, then resumed. Lower. Don't ruin everything. What is everything, James? I asked, keeping my voice level by force of will. A high rise and a list of rules. A pot of gold that belongs to a grave, as much as to a bank. I heard him exhale, the sound of a boy about to lie to his mother and hating himself for it. It's more complicated than you think, he said. Eleanor's firm. He broke off again. We had to move quickly. There were debts, investments. It's not like we're stealing. I offered. The line crackled, and when he spoke next, his voice was not the one I knew. You're being unreasonable. Don't contact anyone else. You're not well. The last 3 words were a hook, baited with contempt and concern. He hung up before I could answer. I stood in the alley's mouth with the wind pushing at my back and understood something new and ugly. The proceeds would already be in motion, running through accounts like water finding every slope. Debts, investments, or a siphon dressed as strategy. A van rattled by, splashing my shoes, and the shock of cold made everything very clear. If I waited for letters to take their stately course, money would vanish into names without faces and laws without teeth. The codicil gave me leverage in daylight. The danger was happening at night. I walked fast toward the main road, heart knocking a rhythm I hadn't danced since James was born, and I decided to live fierce. The city's noise lifted and tilted sirens, brakes, the tinny chorus of a fruit seller shouting prices under a tarp that dripped. My fingers found my phone like they were acting on muscle memory from some other life in some other country. Iviliseki, Aiki Afri, Ike Kriti. Horchi Alki Aimal, Dai Dai Kinya. Tiki Free. TV dramas had taught me a single number for emergency. The screen lit my face with cold blue. I thought of Eleanor's white card, of Mr. Patel's careful clause, of Arthur's signature steady as a vow, of my son's voice turned strange. The codicil was a wall. Someone had driven a car through it and was still accelerating. My thumb hovered over the dial pad as the wind shoved at my coat, and the first drop of a new rain struck the back of my hand. Some breaches aren't only civil. Some betrayals carry the weight of crime, and if I could not yet trust the slow machinery of letters and courts, I would trust the urgency of a voice that answers in seconds. I drew a breath that tasted of diesel and a damp wool, and old resolve, and I began to dial emergency, police, fire, or ambulance. The voice was level, precise, as if it had been honed on the whetstone of 1,000 midnights. Rain fretted at my hairline. The wind pushed the words back into my mouth, and I had to force them out. Police, I said. I swallowed, tasting metal and city grime. It's my son. There's been an unlawful eviction and a sale of my home against a trust. I've a codicil. I'm frightened he'll destroy documents and move the money. My own calm surprised me. It sounded borrowed from a better prepared woman. Are you safe right now? The operator asked. I looked up at the slick street, the hurled light from buses, the fruit seller shouting under a tarp that smelled of wet cardboard and oranges. Yes, I said, but the evidence isn't. A pause, keys clicking softly. Name, I gave it. Location, I gave that too. You said trust and codicil. Do you have them in your possession? Copies, I said, touching my coat, as if to reassure the paper it wasn't alone. And I was forced from the flat. Tonight, another pause, measured, humane. We'll dispatch officers to meet you. Do not approach on your own. A breath. If anyone threatens you, call back immediately. On some mobiles, 911 routes to us. You've reached the right place. The factual kindness threaded me back together. Thank you, I said, ridiculous tears mixing with rain on my cheeks. Please hurry. I didn't wait. Habit is a beast that knows the shortest way home, and mine walked me toward the tower block with a speed that surprised my knees. The wind stung. The pavement shone like fresh slate. By the time I reached the lobby, my coat was spangled with water, and my breath made small ghosts in the air. The security guard, broad-shouldered, kind eyes behind the boredom, looked up. Evening, he said, then registered the suitcase. This old woman he'd watched arrived months ago, and his face softened. You are right, Miss Whitfield. No, I said, and told him quickly, cleanly. His eyebrows rose. We've got CCTV, he murmured, glancing at the monitors where the lift doors opened and closed like blinking eyes. If something happened at the flat, it'll be there. The lift groaned up from the bowels. Cough of cables, smear of disinfectant. I kiss and she fart. Har ankifices. Thint and citrus. That made me think of Eleanor's lists. The doors peeled back, and there they were, stepping out. James, pale and tight around the mouth, and Eleanor in her immaculate coat, phone in hand, diamond at her throat, winking like an alert. For a heartbeat, all I heard was the soft tick of the lobby clock and the wet drip from my sleeve onto the floor tiles. Mom, James began moving toward me with hands open, conciliatory. Kaida say, Arjur Sinchor, Andrew, Chordurchor. Past Peel people approach dogs they're not sure will bite. You shouldn't be here. That line works better, I said, voice steady, when you haven't thrown the person out into the rain. Eleanor's gaze flicked to the security desk, then to the door, calculating. We've called you, she said smoothly. We were worried. You sounded confused. Her tone made the word a bruise, blooming under the skin. The lift chimed again. 2 officers stepped out, blue jackets damp, radios murmuring. The younger one, round face, ponytail tucked under cap, took us in with a sweep that missed nothing. My coat, Eleanor's poise, James's clenched hands, the guard's watchful stillness. I can sick befristi, bunkersti, aintree. I am. P.C. Latham. This is P.C. Doyle, she said. We're here about a reported unlawful eviction and potential fraud. Can we move somewhere quiet? The security guard gestured to the residence lounge. We filed in, the room smelling of new carpet and old coffee, a radiator clicking like a bad conscience. Orgasaki baitie. I laid the codicil on the table with the care of someone placing a newborn down. The officers read. The air thickened. P.C. Latham's eyes lifted to mine. This states you have a life interest and right to occupy, she said, and that a trustee's consent is required for sale. She turned to Eleanor. Are you aware of this document? Eleanor's smile was built of porcelain. I work at a firm. Yes, but I don't handle family matters, she said. This is all a misunderstanding. The property was lawfully transferred. We insured. You insured a lot, I said quietly, including that your firm took over the files of the original trustee. I slid the business card across the table with one finger. Her name stared up at her like a photograph that had always known this day would come. James rubbed his forehead, the gesture of a boy who used to get migraines before exams. We didn't mean to. He stopped, caught on the hook of his own conscience. Mom, we thought that I was luggage, I said, to be transferred, stored, and mislabeled. P.C. Doyle coughed gently. The sound of a man removing a hat without hands. Mrs. Carlyle. He said, careful with each syllable. Are you connected to Graham and Lowther, LLP? She tilted her chin. I am. And did your firm, as successor trustee, consent to the sale? A heartbeat, a calculation, a blink. We, our property team, handled the conveyance, she said at last. Any trust obligations would have been considered. By whom? Latham asked. Names. Please. Eleanor's lips flattened into a white line. The security guard stepped to the doorway, cleared his throat. Officers, he said, cheeks reddening, as if he were intruding on family. If it helps, camera shows Amy's. Carlyle and Mr. Whitfield removing a suitcase and a box from Ms. Whitfield's room earlier today. Time stamped. Also, he scratched his neck. There was a call to change the guest fob permissions yesterday. P.C. Latham's pen moved. Thank you, she said. She turned to me. Did you have personal documents in that box? My bank passbook, letters, the incense tin, I said. The tin is here. I touched my coat. The rest, I let the sentence trail. Eleanor exhaled through her nose, the sound of a kettle refusing to sing. This is absurd, she said, the veneer cracking just enough to show the steel beneath. If there were funds, they've been allocated to investments. We had margin calls. She cut herself off. Too late. Latham's pen stilled. Allocated from proceeds of a sale, arguably in breach of trust. She said, that's potentially fraud by abuse of position. The word fraud hit the air and stayed there. A new smell, metallic and clean. James sat down as if his knees had negotiated a private truce with gravity. We didn't think, he whispered, then louder, panic sharpening. We didn't think it would hurt you. Mom, you'd still have a place with us. He gestured vaguely around the room that had never been mine. It's just money, I said, not unkindly. The shock was draining. In its place, a clarity rose, cold and bright. It makes people forget who they promised to be. P.C. Doyle's radio crackled. He inclined his head, listening to a voice too soft for us. Controls flagged linked reports, he said to Latham. Solicitor's pre-action letter sent an hour ago to Graham and Lowther. Their switchboard called us to note a disturbance in reception. Latham looked at Eleanor. Your firm is aware, she said, which means the file exists. She turned to James. Sir, I'm going to ask you to hand over your phone. He blinked. Why? Because we will request a voluntary download of messages between you and Miss Carlyle referencing the transfer and sale. You can, of course, refuse, but we can also seek a production order. Your choice now speaks loudly later. Eleanor's hand flew out, gripping his wrist. Don't, she hissed. I nausticos, a nust-o whisper that cut the room. The diamond at her throat flared. Small lightning. In that instant, so quick, you might have missed it. If you weren't a mother trained to read boys' faces, James saw her, truly saw her, not as the woman who had redesigned his future, but as someone who would place her hand over his mouth if the truth tried to escape. He pulled his wrist free. His phone hit the table with a soft, mammal thud. I'll cooperate, he said, voice hoarse. Something fragile slid out of his eyes and onto the floor. Latham bagged the phone. Nita's Sunday ironing. Doyle asked Eleanor for hers. She laughed once, sharp as glass. On what basis? On the basis, he said, as if reciting a psalm he believed in, that you are a potential suspect in a fraud, an unlawful eviction investigation. You can refuse. We'll note it. Silence held. Her jaw worked. I want my solicitor, she said at last. Very sensible, Latham replied evenly. Until then, you are not to delete or alter anything on that device. This is an active scene. Do you understand? Eleanor sat back, arms folded, eyes hard enough to scratch the table. It was the security guard who saved the next hour. He printed the CCTV stills gray ghosts stepping through the corridor. My suitcase between them, and the officers photographed them. Flash, stuttering against glass. Outside, sirens drew their red stitches through the rain, then passed on. Inside, the radiator clicked and settled and clicked again. A lullaby of the modern cliff. Mrs. Whitfield, Latham said, turning to me with a softness that didn't dull her edge. We can take a statement now. Arrange for emergency accommodation if needed, and log this as both an unlawful eviction and suspected fraud. Your solicitors already got the civil gears turning. We'll send a unit to Graham and Lowther to secure relevant material if they'll cooperate. We'll also notify Action Fraud tonight, so the financial flag goes on the accounts. It's not a freeze, but it's a light we can shine. She paused. Do you have somewhere safe to stay? I do, I said, thinking of the little room above the spice-scented shop and the incense smoke that braided with rain. James tried to speak. Words tangled, then came free in a rush. Mom, I can fix this. You will tell the truth, I said. To them and to yourself. He flinched. And then, God help me, I saw the boy with the paper crown again, the one who'd promised the flames. He would keep the ancestors safe. For a second, my anger was a sea pulling back from the shore, drawing breath for a larger wave. Eleanor stood. This is theater, she said, lip curling. Middle-class guilt dressed as law. She pushed her chair back. It squealed. We're leaving. Doyle stepped into her path, not touching, just there, a doorway that had discovered its purpose. No, Ms. Carlyle, he said gently, you're staying. Latham's radio cracked again. She listened. Da Stacy, Borski, Daichin, An Christian, Bon then turned to me with news that smelled like ozone. Your solicitors just obtained an emergency without notice application listed before the duty judge in 1 hour. She said, if the injunction's granted, it'll freeze transfer of the $2 $2 million pending determination. We can serve it tonight. The room breathed in. I tasted something like ginger on my tongue. Shock turning to heat. Honeygunther, thank you. I managed. We filed back to the lobby, me, with my coat buttoned to the throat. The officers, a calm, Blue weather front, James gray-faced. Eleanor a statue with a pulse. The doors side open. The rain had eased to a fine mist that silvered the air. The security guard raised a hand in a salute, so awkward and heartfelt, I had to swallow twice. Outside, traffic hissed on wet tarmac. The city's breath lifted and fell. At the curb, Latham touched my arm. Warm palm through wool. We'll meet you at court after we've collected statements, she said. Tonight will be long, but you've done the right thing. I nodded. My legs wanted to fold. My spine refused. One more thing, I said, and turned to James. He met my eyes, naked and wrecked. Tell the truth about the altar, I said softly, about what you promised your father and our dead, because even if no court hears it, they will. He let out a sound I'd never heard from him before. Not a sob, not a word, something torn free. Eleanor made a sound too, small and furious, like a kettle that realizes it will never boil. The mist beaded on my lashes. The air smelled of petrol and the ghost of sandalwood that clung to my coat. I stepped into the night that was waiting with open hands. Thank goodness the doors slid shut behind me with a hush that felt like the turning of a page. Dawn came the color of weak tea, and Birmingham steamed like a damp dog shaking itself awake. By mid-morning, I was outside the county court with P.C. Latham's calm beside me and my solicitor smelling faintly of lavender and grit. The judge looked like he'd been carved from Yorkshire stone. No nonsense, weatherproof. My solicitor laid out the codicil, the transfer, the sale, the eviction. The words life interest and breach of trust landed like paving slabs. Eleanor sat rigid, immaculate as a chess queen. James as a subordinate, gray around the edges, kept swallowing as if every breath had to be negotiated. When the order came, it came clean. An interim injunction, freezing the $2 million. Disclosure of the trust file. Aisaki, Bankikago, Ankense Priguri, Borchungaker, Bas Bajorgi. Prohibition on further dealing with proceeds. Police given leave to secure electronic communications. The gavel's soft rap sounded like a lid on a boiling pot. Outside, the air tasted of petrol and relief. That's the first wall, my solicitor murmured. Now we build the house. The days that followed were long and oddly quiet, as if the city were waiting to see who we would be when the dust settled. Eleanor resigned from Graham and Lowther, pending investigation. A thin statement appeared online, bloodless as a winter sun. James gave a recorded interview and returned his key fob without being asked, as if the small act might balance a ledger he had only just learned to read. At my little room above the shop, I brewed tea and made soup that warmed the air. Neighbors sent up Tupperware with stewed lamb and a sponge cake that tasted of Sundays. We look after our own, Mrs., Ahmed said, pushing a parcel into my hands. Always have. The words anchored me more than I let on. When the developer's file arrived by courier, a cardboard coffin of emails and timesheets, my solicitor and I sifted until our fingers smelled of paper and toner. We found the spine, a chain of messages that showed Eleanor had known the trust terms, had pressed to expedite completion, had dismissed the life interest as a cultural accommodation not recorded at HM Land Registry. My solicitor snorted softly at that, the sound of a woman who had sat through too many tidy dismissals. Culture is not a doily to be put away when guests come, she said, and rang counsel. The police did their part, quiet, methodical, the blue light of screens reflected in patient eyes. In one message, James wrote, "Mom believes it's just paperwork. She trusts me." Reading it was like stepping barefoot on glass. He saw it too when they showed him. "I was a coward," he said, in the interview room, voice frayed. "I was led, and I liked being led because it felt like success." Latham didn't nod and didn't look away. "What are you now?" she asked. He closed his eyes. A son who forgot the difference between a lift and a theft. The settlement, when it came, was careful. The court restored my life interest and right to occupy, ordered an account of profits, imposed a constructive trust over the proceeds. Costs followed the event. As they say in England, those who had fiddled the tune paid for the band. Eleanor faced her own music with the regulator. Words like conflict and sanction entered rooms she had once moved through like perfume. The developer took its share of blame and disgorged fees as if spitting out gristle it had tried to swallow. And James, my boy, who had grown apart in strange, expensive air, sold the high-rise flat and stood on the pavement, watching a van swallow furniture that had never fit him. "I'll find a smaller place," he said when he came to see me. Voice raw, "A place with a window that knows my name." I told him only, "Make it somewhere. Your heart can hear you." He nodded. "Anything. Ankergisem. Ankersisie. Angerkort." In his nod was a small, stubborn seed. I moved back to the narrow alley in early spring. The developer, chastened and poorer, had finished the refurbishment and under the court's stern eye, returned the house to the shape of a life rather than a brochure. The hearth open, the skirting boards painted honest, a corner cleared where the altar had once stood. On moving day, the alley smelled of rain-washed brick and chippy vinegar. Mr. Warpechter Hughes banged his stick in applause as the van doors flew open. Inside, I unpacked with reverence, running a hand along the familiar dip in the banister, feeling the grain of the floorboards like an old palm offered for reading. When I set the wooden altar back on its table, it fit the space with a sigh. I polished the brass holder, laid mandarins bright as small suns, and poured green tea, whose steam kissed my face. We are back. I told the photographs, and the house, polite as ever, held its breath to listen. It was James who asked to come for the first full moon. He arrived with flowers, not from a shop, but from the market, stems damp, paper crinkling like a confession. In the kitchen, he lingered by the stew, breathing in star anise and soy, as if scent could ferry him across years. "Mum," he said, not quite steady, "teach me the words." We lit incense. The smoke curled and twined. Old rope mended. I guided his fingers as he placed the sticks, watched him bow with the awkward sincerity of a man building a bridge, plank by plank. "To your grandfather," I said softly, "who worked steel so you could hold a pen. To your father, who put this life interest in ink so I could hold a home. To all the mothers who kept their families threaded in the fog." He swallowed. "To you," he added, and the smoke didn't argue. We didn't pretend the past hadn't happened. That kind of pretending is the cousin of lying. Instead, we set the table with both truth and soup. Over bowls that steamed up our faces, James talked. "I thought success was noise," for I said. "I thought love was furniture. I thought being a husband meant being a captain." He stared at the spoon. I forgot I was a son. I told him a thing my father used to say in a voice like gravel warmed by sun. Better a late apology than a neat excuse. He laughed once, broken but clean. "You always did have the better proverbs," he said, and for a minute We were just a mother and a man with the same eyes, making peace at a wooden table that had seen worse weather. At Lunar New Year, the alley gathered itself like a choir. Children raced, cheeks apple red. A string of firecrackers snapped like impatient knitting. Doors opened to let luck wander in and out. I scrubbed the floors until they shone and arranged the offerings fish for abundance, rice for unity, oranges for brightness, while outside, Mrs. Ahmed strung fairy lights round her gate as if blessing could be braided with wire. James arrived with a tin of sesame biscuits and a bottle of ginger beer. He stood at the threshold, fingers touching the door frame with a tenderness that could pass for prayer. "Shall I hang the banners?" he asked. "Left higher than right," I said, and watched as he made it so. As midnight slid close, we walked to the cemetery where my parents lay under a scrub of ivy and Birmingham's stubborn sky. The ground smelled of wet earth and cut grass. Foxes had written their cursive in the mud. I lit joss sticks. The sparks lifted like small moths. "Gran," James said into the dark, voice steadying against the cold. "I have been foolish. I have been greedy. I forgot the thread." He placed his palm flat on the stone, and in that gesture, I saw a boy pressing a paper crown to his head, determined not to let it slip. The smoke rose, carrying meat and citrus and the work of our hands. And for a moment, the air tasted faintly of iced buns and factory wool and coal fires and everything we had been to one another. On the walk back, our breaths stitched white into the dark. "What happens now?" he asked. The honest fear of a man beginning again. "We live properly," I said. "We keep our doors open and our promises tighter. We remember that the eldest son inherits duty before he inherits anything else. We keep an altar because we know we did not build this alone. And when we disagree, we do it at this table with a kettle on and our tempers tied short." He exhaled, a mist that felt like a scent. "All right," he said, and this time it meant something. Later, when the house had settled into its familiar creaks and the year turned over like a coin in a careful hand, I stood at the window and watched the alley shine with the puddled gold of fairy lights. Birmingham's breath was in my lungs, sandalwood threaded with the smell of vinegar and frying batter and rain. The photograph of Arthur watched from the altar, his eyes amused, a man who had bet on me long before I knew how to place a wager. I touched the frame and felt the simple, stern joy of a promise kept. "You home," I whispered, the word soft as a blessing and hard as a rule. And somewhere in the quiet that belongs to houses that have learned your name, the ancestors rustled like satisfied pages. The story of a mother displaced and returned begins with a January eviction and a betrayal camouflaged as just paperwork. In Birmingham's tight-knit alley, ancestral rites, full moon incense, and Lunar New Year offerings root the narrator in a life of duty and memory. Her son James, drawn upward by modern aspirations and Eleanor's polished control, convinces her to transfer the house. Months later, she discovers the home was sold for $2 million. In the tower block, rules replace love, and a clash over rituals exposes the deeper plan. A cedarwood scent leads to a hidden envelope. The truth surfaces in rain and shock. She moves out, lights incense in a small rented room, and begins the slow, steady march to justice, bank records, citizens' advice, a tenacious solicitor, and neighbors who remember. A codicil emerges her late husband's life interest gift, witnessed by Mr. Hughes and guarded by a trustee whose files Eleanor's firm absorbed. Conflict becomes crime when duty is abused. She dials for help, and officers arrive. In the residence lounge, a mother sets down her paper shield, and the law answers. An injunction freezes the money. Disclosures expose conflicts. The developer disgorges fees. Eleanor falls from her pedestal. James faces himself in the mirror of his messages. In spring, the alley house breathes again. The altar returns. Smoke rises with quiet authority. James comes back, not with swagger, but with flowers that still carry market rain. He learns the words, hangs the banners, and kneels by his grandparents' stone, promising to hold the thread he once dropped. The tale closes where it began, in a small house that smells of sandalwood and stew, affirming British family values, duty before inheritance, truth before comfort, aninsi, unstake, an woichiu, aichir, ankeu. A home that is built not only of brick, but of remembered names, shared bread, and promises made aloud.